Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our expert panel on reimagining civic education. We have some incredible panelists with us today who I will introduce in just a moment, but wanted to first remind you that we'll be collecting questions throughout the panel. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask one of these panelists, please put it into the chat, which you can find somewhere down there on your screen. And also wanted to just tell you a little bit about why we, the Teachers Guild, are so excited to have this collaboration in partnership with ASCD. We've been hearing from teachers over the summer and last school year that civics is a really important question to them. In the heat of this election cycle and with so many race events over the summer, teachers want to know how they can proceed with conversations with students, how they can celebrate students' voice, and help to prepare students to be the next sort of civic leaders of tomorrow. And we are really excited to challenge you as teachers to come up with solutions that develop students to own their voice, to know their unique civic potential, and to be engaged. So we're thrilled to have this collaboration in partnership with ASCD, and are extra excited for this panel discussion because we have been working with other incredible partners, some of whom are represented here, including iCivics, Circle at Tufts, and El Paso School District. So we're really honored to have these folks here, and I will just go ahead and introduce them. So first we have Peter Levine. Peter is the Associate Dean for Research at the Center for Citizenship and Public Affairs within Tufts University's Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life. He was also formerly a director at Tisch's College's Circle, which is the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. He's also the author of We Are the Ones We Have Been Waiting For, The Promise of Civic Renewal in America. Hi, Peter. We also have Emma Humphries. So Emma Humphries is the Chief Education Officer at iCivics, which, if you don't already know about it, is fantastic. It's an educational nonprofit dedicated to reinvigorating civic learning through interactive and engaging learning resources. Emma has spent much of her career devoted to teaching and learning and advocating for civic education, including serving as a social studies teacher in North Florida, where she taught all levels of American government and history. We have as well Eric Russo, or Principal Russo, as I'm sure he's referred to as many. He's the assistant principal at Chavez School, Parkside Middle School. He spent the majority of his time in education as a special educator in reading and English language arts. He is also a member of ASCD's Whole Child Network of Schools and has presented at conferences locally and nationally, and is really passionate about civic education and is doing some great things at Chavez. And then finally, we have Crystal Bustillos. She is a teacher within, hi Crystal, within El Paso Independent School District. She's been teaching for 5 years and is currently the Social Studies Department Chair at Andres High School. And she has her master's in political science and also teaches political science at the University of Texas in El Paso. So we have some incredible panelists, all of whom are really exploring the question of civics and the future of civic engagement within schools at all different levels. We're so honored and thrilled to have you here. So the first question that I would love to ask you all is a question that's been coming up for us a lot as we've started to launch this project and started to talk to various partners about it, to teachers, and that is really what is civic education, right? We've heard that civics isn't just that 10th grade civics class that happens. It's so much more than that. So I'd love to just to kick us off with that question of what really is civics education, and I will pass it first to Peter.
Thanks, Emma. And hi, everybody, and really looking forward to the conversation. I'll just kind of kick it off. I mean, I think, the official answer, what is civic education, is education that prepares kids to be, when they're adults, good citizens. And then you have to ask, what's good citizens? And it includes lots of actions like voting and volunteering and running for office and leading communities, but also probably values and all kinds of things are built into that. So partly the official answer, you'd find this in state standards, for example, is, civic education prepares people to be good citizens. I guess I'd just like to build on it in three quick ways. One is, it is the civics curriculum in this usually part of the social studies, but it's not only that, because we teach kids in good ways or not so good ways to be citizens in so many other places. For example, if the whole school is set up to be a place that values all the kids and encourages them to express their voice and makes them feel like they have an important role, then it's good civic education. If the whole school is a place where you're arbitrarily suspended for no good reason, then that's bad civic education. So it's much broader than, it's also interdisciplinary. It's not just about social studies, although it is about social studies, and that's important. That's one thing. Second thing is, it's not just about preparation, because kids are citizens now. And so it's also about their ability to act right now in the present, starting in the kindergarten classroom, maybe the pre-K classroom, I don't know about that, but all the way up to high school. And then I guess, I think I have a different third point, but I'll add this third point. Then, of course, citizenship means, it means in the sense of an active, engaged participant in the communities in which you live. So it's not about legal citizenship. It's more than that, in the sense that having a passport is not the definition of citizenship, but also there's important roles for citizens even if they're not carrying a passport. So let me stop with that and see what other people add.
Emma, I'd love to pass it to you.
Yeah, so I always kind of joke, and it's an old and tired joke. I need new material, but we have a hard time with civics, because when someone hears that word, they just think of like a two-door Honda sports car. And if you say, no, I'm not talking about the car, I'm talking about education, then they really have no idea what you're talking about. So we suffer a sort of definitional issue with the term, and I think when people hear it, they just sort of tune out, because it just sounds kind of boring. It inspires really bad memories of boring coursework. But for me, it's the original purpose and mission of our public schools. It's why we're here. It's why we take seriously the education of our young people. It's the lifeblood of our democratic republic. It's education for citizenship at its most basic, at the root of it, at the heart of it, I should say. It is not simply American Government 101 or American history or sociology or economics or political science. It's, in fact, all of these things packaged together with a focus on the role of citizens and how they can work together or individually to influence policy and affect positive change. And for me to really nerd out on it, because this is what I'm most passionate about, it's education that should inspire our students towards a lifetime of informed and fierce and tireless engagement in their communities and in public life.
Wow. Just to kind of build on those two definitions, either to Emma or to Peter, can civics happen in informal ways in schools? Are there ways in which it shows up not just in a planned period, for example, but in other informal ways?
Yeah, and I think Peter touched on this when he said it's not just the formal curriculum. And I think when schools are doing it right, and I suspect that some of our other panelists represent schools that are doing it right, it's really infused throughout the entire day, and it's not just happening in social studies classrooms. It's not just happening when teachers are hitting those very specific citizenship or civic or American government benchmarks. But I think I would defer to some of the other panelists to talk about what precisely that looks like.
Yeah. And that sort of actually leads into the sort of next question, which I'd love to hear both from Eric and from Crystal, just about when you see civics. So we've heard this broad definition of civic education. It's not just the formal, it's not just the planned, it's also just this like bold aspirational piece to develop citizenship in students. With you, Eric, and with Crystal, when you've seen civics being implemented at its best, what does that look like? Either in your classroom, across the whole school, what are some examples of ways that you've seen civics really take off in powerful ways in schools?
I think for me, when I think about civics, I think about students taking ownership, right? So students becoming leaders, taking ownership in what they're doing and in their future, right? So what I've seen here is that students get excited. You know, students come up, like we have all different kinds of clubs and projects going on where students come up with ways to deal with today's issues and problems that they're dealing with in like real world issues, right? And so students get excited, they get passionate about that. When you transfer the learning over to them, and they're still learning, right? They're doing something they care about, but they're still learning. And I think that's like the exciting part.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I think I'm kind of thinking of it as an administrator from two levels. So when it's working really well and I'm thinking about my teachers and the educators in the building, they're infusing civics education into their curriculum seamlessly. So it becomes part of sort of like an unspoken curriculum, right? And I think that happens in, as Peter was saying, interdisciplinary focus. That could happen very easily in an ELA class, as easily as it could happen in a social studies class. And, you know, some people don't think that it can happen in a math class, but it could happen there certainly as well. I'm a public policy school, and so we try and really focus on sort of a social justice and public policy slant. And so I kind of am challenging my teachers this year to sort of think about how their academic and even the Common Core standards can support the idea of civics education. And then sort of at the student level from the whole school, some of the things we're really trying to implement this year is, as Crystal was saying, giving the power back to the students. So we have some restorative practices that we're really implementing with peer mediators, so that we're asking kids to come in and help mediate between their peers rather than us facilitating that. And that takes some training and things. I walked into a classroom though a couple weeks ago, and it looked like there was an issue, and one of my 8th graders turned around. She said, "We got it, Mr. Russo. We want you to trust us. We're handling our business." I looked at the teacher and she nodded, and I walked away. And it was like a really powerful moment because this is the 2nd year I'm in here as an administration. And so we're seeing some of these things take off with the kids that were with us last year. And so that's really exciting.
That's awesome. Eric, just sort of building on that, when you've talked about this civics education becoming almost like an unspoken curriculum across your school, where it's deeply embedded into all of the things that your teachers do, whether it's math to anything else, I'm wondering, how have you helped to set that up within your school? You mentioned you're a public policy school, but what are some of the strategies you work with your teachers to support them to think about that?
So this is kind of a newer shift for us, and so it's kind of a work in progress. But if you take one of the major literacy standards that is cross-content, you know, one of the major pieces that addresses writing and literacy is the ability to address a claim and the evidence that comes across to support that claim, which is the basis of argumentation, which is what civics is all about, right? So we're, you know, like if a kid comes to me and they say, "Oh, Mr. Russo, I don't really like, why'd you guys change the shoe policy?" And I say something like, "Oh, I didn't change the shoe policy, home office did. Let's write some letters and let's put some reasons why," and, you know, try and engage them. The Chavez school's mission is to create students that will be able to use public policy to advocate for their communities and give back to the community. So we're trying to infuse in that. But I was talking to, and kind of the conversations are still happening at the sort of like instructional coach level. bringing it back down to the teachers, but I was talking with my math teacher about statistics and probability and how that can be used, how statistics are used to marginalize or build up certain members of society, and how that can be explored, sort of this social justice slant in the context of a math class. And it's very early in the conversation. I don't want to pretend like this is happening and it's seamless right now, but I very much believe that it could be happening in every content class.
Yeah, that's great. And Crystal, actually, similar question to you. You mentioned that for you, civics is about students taking ownership. So I'd love to hear some of the strategies you use in your class to help students take that ownership over their learning.
Well, I think it's more so campus-based as well. So again, we sort of force them to be civically engaged by way of requiring community service, right? And then we have our student government and things like that. But we try to offer them opportunities to make it their own. So they come up with their projects. We're also we're bringing in IB to our school, and part of that component is that they do CAS, right, which is community service, and they need to come up with the initiatives. Like, it's all they're driving it, right? So it's not necessarily in any one given class, but it is kind of like campus based, right? Yeah. I think for them as a class, whenever we're doing curriculum, and this is something I stress to all teachers in my department especially, is that we are not the controllers, right? The students are in control. And so it's kind of like what we said is, if they have a problem or something, we deal with it on their level, so to speak.
So switching gears and thinking about the other side, right? We've heard what is civics. We've heard the goal of a really strong civic education program. We've heard about what it looks like when civics education is being implemented at its best, that it's happening in an interdisciplinary way, that it's supporting students to own their voice, that it's really student-driven. I'd love, on the flip side, to talk about what are some of the current gaps within civic education. What are the root causes of those gaps? So would love to start off actually with Emma. I'd love to hear your perspective on this, sort of thinking about where you sit, looking across. What are some of the gaps that you see within civic education?
The first is just we don't have the sort of widespread access to it. So we know from the work of Peter and his colleagues that every single state requires civics instruction in some form or fashion. But what that looks like in terms of the required coursework and the accountability measures attached to it just differs vastly across the country. And it's kind of funny being in Florida, right? Because Florida doesn't really have a good reputation for many things. I think ever since the 2000 election, we just get a bad rap. But one thing we're doing right is civics, and it's because we're teaching it, we're mandating it, we're requiring it. We have a 7th grade civics course, and there is an assessment attached to it. Now, please don't take me as someone who gets excited about assessments. I do not. But we know that what is tested is what is taught, which means that in Florida, civics is being taught. I don't know that we could say that across the country. So that's the first issue, is just it's not being taught enough. I think in most states, we're really happy if students are getting 1 semester of American government their senior year of high school. And if you consider how many students drop out before their senior year of high school, that's really alarming. That means the students who need this kind of education most aren't getting it. So the first issue of it needs to be taught more, and I think it needs to be taught in the lower grades. That's sort of the huge gap. We're not seeing enough of that. Then it's the pedagogy, what's happening in the classroom. So we know that high quality civic education looks like students engaging in really rich, authentic discussions around current and controversial issues that they find to be relevant to their lives. Well, those same issues are the same issues that teachers don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. Just thinking about this current election, you brought it up in your introduction. I think it was really timely to do so. We usually consider an election, especially a presidential election, to be this sort of national teachable moment, right? The entire country is talking about what we need to be teaching as social studies teachers. Yet, for the first time, at least in recent memory, the election seems like a controversial issue on par with gun control and abortion and climate and everything else. And that's really alarming. So my guess is that we're seeing huge gaps in that kind of controversial issues discussion. And I think we're also seeing gaps in terms of one of the major topics of this whole initiative, this whole effort, which is action civics and getting the curriculum sort of outside of the classroom, getting students outside of the classroom. That's also really scary for teachers. I think they feel ill-equipped to do it. And so it's just not happening enough. And for very good reasons. There's all sorts of justification anyone could provide for why it's not happening. But that's a problem, and we need to see more of that.
Yeah. Eric, would love to also pass the same question to you, especially as you mentioned the development of your policy focus or the civic focus within Chavez as a work in progress. I'd love to know what you see as some of the gaps as an administrator.
I think that, there are sort of, in terms of teachers, logistical things like pacing guides, standards, pressure to cover material, things that we try and alleviate. But the reality is there's benchmarks that are set and things that even teacher evaluations kind of give that sort of pressure, I think, to not deviate from the script, and the script being the curriculum, I guess. There are sometimes other things that I think, in education, it's very much popular to say that everyone is a literacy teacher, right? And then you have these people that say, oh, no, not really. And sometimes when you ask people to think about civics, they say, oh, well, I'm not a social studies teacher. And, so I think sometimes it's about mindset too. And I think very much, I agree with what Emma said. It's scary to bring up some of these topics with the students, and also as a teacher to actually give over the reins to facilitate a discussion rather than lead a discussion. So we are actually tomorrow launching across all 4 of our schools, all 4 Chavez schools, a Just Free Equal move hashtag. And it's really going to be a year-long exploration around policing in America. And we are all teaching the same lesson to all the kids. Really, we are acknowledging Black Lives Matter and speaking about that, but we wanted to be separate from that so that we weren't politicizing it, but really just exploring what it means, how it is done, how do we maybe effectively engage with police in different situations. And so I'm really interested to see how this unfolds, because we're doing it across all 4 campuses. 1,400 students are going to be engaging. Every teacher is going to be engaging in this conversation initially, and then it'll kind of go into a social studies focus. So I think in some cases, it's what might hinder a teacher is feeling they can't do that or not getting that go-ahead or that permission from administration or support from the administration, or in our case, organizationally, to go ahead and engage these conversations. So we're not worried, our teachers aren't worried that some parent's going to call and be irate that we're having these conversations, because we're supporting them and actually, pushing them out.
Interesting. I think the piece about giving over the reins is a really interesting theme, and the tension that educators can feel in doing that when at the same time there's so much expectations around hitting certain benchmarks and preparing students to pass certain assessments, and so much pressure on teachers generally. So I think that's a really interesting theme to potentially explore for all of you listeners who are about to engage in this 10-week design journey. That could be a really interesting opportunity area to think about how might teachers give over the reins more so that student voice can thrive. And so that's a really great point. Thanks, Eric. I think I want to move on from this question, but just to go back actually to something, Emma, you had mentioned. I'd love Peter to chime in on this. So we actually heard a lot about the assessment piece with civics, that it's not tested and therefore it's not taught, and that's a challenge. And it's just, I'm so curious, what just really quickly, what would a assessing civics look like? And I'd love to hear, Peter, from you.
Yeah, that's a good question, because on the whole, I think we've had kind of a dilemma. We either have had no test or we've had fairly bad tests. I mean, Florida's investment is one of the more significant investments, so I'm not going to say Florida's test is bad. We're actually supporting the Florida effort and think that there might be some potential there. But on the whole, that just to generalize it across all the 50 states, they've either been no test or bad test. Bad test meaning, for one thing, multiple choice questions almost entirely about factual information. And actually not even good at that because they're typically really cheap. I mean, really, states that have standardized tests and civics typically spend almost nothing on them. And so even the factual questions are usually kind of lousy. And, then we also have the movement right now, which I'm against, although I'm happy to discuss, to make all students pass the U.S. citizenship test to graduate from high school. But the reason I'm against it is because that's a lousy test. It's 100 questions. You can memorize the answers in advance. They're miscellaneous. Nobody's ever looked to see whether they measure something important. Actually, someone did look to see whether they measure something important. There was a pretty sophisticated psychological study of those items, and they were found to be lousy. I'd have to look up the citation for that, but I'm pretty sure it's true. So, but the real reason it's a dilemma is because if you don't have a test, then what Emma said before is also true, which is then you really don't emphasize it. And one thing that we've already, I think, learned in Florida is you add a test, you suddenly get more attention. So I think Emma will confirm this or not, but I think there's actually even more students doing pre-service teacher education in civics rapidly more in Florida all of a sudden because there's a need for teaching. So the dilemma has been bad test or no test. And I mean, the one solution to that would be really good test, which is what you asked me. So I gave a long, rambling answer. So the answer, it doesn't exist. I mean, we don't have really good tests, but I think they would be, they'd be much closer to a simulation of some kind of civic activity. It'd be much more, first, they might be interactive with multiple kids involved. You'd be deriving data evidence about how the kids interacted with each other. It'd be much more applied, although you'd also need good information. So you would still have to learn about the three branches of the government because you wouldn't be able to do the simulation well, but you'd really be using that for some reason. And I believe we can get there, although I think that getting there is going to be really expensive. And I mean, easily affordable by the federal government, but it's something they would actually have to do, which they haven't been willing to do. Although it's interesting to think, I know this is getting ahead of us because you're later going to want to talk about what we should do, but it'd be really interesting to think about these teachers and others, imagining assessments that at least they could use themselves in their own classrooms that were much more interactive. Yeah, so in brief, I would say we should be civics is about interacting with other people. So it's crazy to tell people, we're going to measure your civics, so fill out some paper and nobody can look at your paper while you're working on this. Civics is about interaction, right? So an assessment in which kids were actually talking, listening, solving problems together. And actually teachers using that kind of assessment in their own classrooms is a great way to start because it's also low stakes. I mean, it would only be for informing them about maybe giving a grade. It doesn't have to be for some kind of higher authority. So.
Yeah. Emma, I'll kick it back to you. I know you, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to start by saying that I'm simply a member of NCSS. I don't work for them in any official capacity, but I just finished reading my most recent edition of Social Education, and very esteemed colleagues, Walter Parker from Washington, and then Jane Lowe, who's actually from Florida State University, so she's a Florida friend. They have a great article on, so it's called Give Us Your Best Advice, Assessing Deep Political Learning. And what they lay out here is what I would consider a really great assessment for civics. It's called a complex scenario test. It's a classroom-based performance assessment. It can be used summatively, formatively. It requires students to work together. It requires them to take in new information after they've already started and to adjust. And it goes to show that you can absolutely evaluate student learning in an authentic and rich and meaningful way. It's just maybe a little bit more complicated. And what's really important and makes this such a strong example is that they're pulling this off in an AP government classroom. That's where they've done all their research and all their work to show that project-based learning can work despite such a rigorous and pressure-filled sort of environment, and that students will succeed on the exam and report feeling more satisfaction and greater likelihood to participate. So we know it can be done. We have people studying this very question, and I think Peter's right that an investment by the federal government would make this sort of thing very doable. They even offer sort of different levels to offer you have the complex assessment, but then there's a more basic level of it that we could pull off at scale if people thought it were important enough and the investment were to be made.
That's really exciting, and also sounds like a really interesting resource for educators to check out, and potentially also a really great opportunity for this upcoming collaboration to think about. I'm almost thinking about assessment hacks. There is no state mandated, potentially no state mandated test for civics, but that doesn't prevent teachers from maybe doing some really interactive, interesting assessments within their class to gauge that. So that's really cool. Thanks for sharing. While we're on this kind of pedagogy, kind of content track that we're talking about, I'd love to ask a question that came in from an educator actually within our community who was really interested in the vertical alignment of civics up through grades. Peter, this is something you mentioned right at the beginning. We also heard at our partner kickoff ask the question, how might civics become the next STEM? And I think that's a really interesting question, because what it implies is sort of this like full integration of civics, not only across disciplines, but vertically up through grades. So I'd love to hear a little bit about some strategies that you've seen implemented that support that, things that you can do quickly or larger programmatic efforts that have happened that support that vertical alignment of civics up through grades. And I'd love to first begin with Eric. As a policy school, as a school really focused on civics across grades and across disciplines, are there ways that you're currently thinking about that vertical alignment up through grades? And would just love to hear kind of some thoughts that you have, whether you've started to do things or you're thinking about things as a work in progress.
Well, so I guess I can answer that in a couple different ways, but I'll say that we are currently in the process of sort of reimagining how that looks. We are a 6 through 12 organization. And so traditionally, or in the past, a lot of the policy-focused work has been focused in the high school level. So we're trying to bring more opportunities into the middle school level, as Emma was talking about earlier, starting earlier. So each year, there's sort of a major project that builds as they in sort of capacity and rigor as they go through the grades. So our 6th graders have a city council day where they go and address a problem. Last year, our students went and talked to council members about gentrification and affordable housing in DC. Our 7th grade participates in something called the Hill Day, and they actually go to Capitol Hill and appeal to them about different topics and areas of concern. And then 8th grade is focused on U.S. history, and they do in DC, we have a We the People competition. And so they participate in that, and that's kind of the sort of the big end of the year culminating projects. As they move into high school, they certainly have their service learning, but Chavez culminates in what's called our senior thesis, in which the students take a policy that they feel strongly about, and they really research it for the entire year, and culminates in a 20-page paper that is about what the current policies are, what the conflicting agreements are, and then ultimately what their proposed plan is. And then that's sort of celebrated by picking the top 3 or 4 students. Right now we have been doing a symposium at Georgetown University where the students present their plans through presentation and everything, and that's like really the culminating process. And so when we think about it as the middle school level, like if that is the goal as a senior, how do we plan backwards, and how do we start preparing our kids to be able to do that, so that when they get to that class, it's not a shock and overload that everyone's just cramming in the last minute to get their 20-page paper written, and that we can choose from 100, kids to pick the top best 5. And so I think that is still very much a work in progress. And then I think this just, free, equal movement that we're kind of talking about that's starting tomorrow is a new step that we're taking that is engaging from all levels, but looks different in the middle school than it would in the high school. And so I think that's partially how we are starting to address this idea of public policy and what it even means to the students.
That's exciting. Wow. That makes me sort of want to go back. That makes me want to be a student at Chavez, all of those things that you just mentioned. Crystal, I'd love to ask the same question to you, either sort of on the vertical side, how you as a social studies department chair are thinking about supporting other grades as they move up to progress. And then, even on the interdisciplinary side, which is just such a big theme, love to hear a little bit about how you think about it or how EPISD thinks about it in general.
Well, that's something that we're kind of just struggling with right now. So, for example, our civics class is not until senior year, and they are tested in U.S. history on topics that are related to civics, as that fall in line with U.S. history as juniors and as sophomores. So they don't really necessarily follow a sequence of classes, and that's where we're kind of struggling. So we'd love to have them, be freshmen in one class and then follow through so we can do that kind of scaffolding with them. And so we're working on getting that alignment in place because all of our students have shown that where they're messing up on our standardized U.S. history test is all the government and civic stuff. Like that's what they're struggling with. So we're putting basically some interventions in place, and we're still developing those to see how we can help our lower level classes focus on those topics in their teaching, right? So when they're covering world geography or world history, how they can explain it, and they're not necessarily experts on that. And that's something that we as the government teachers have to teach them how to teach. And so that's something we're dealing with now.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it sort of makes me think back to a prior question that I'd actually love to ask you, Crystal, just about, we had heard a little bit about some of the gaps at a very high level around teaching quality civics, so we've, assessments and all of that, holding the line and not feeling comfortable giving students the reins, so to speak. I'd just love to hear, what are some of the gaps that you're seeing, or what are just some of the challenges as you're thinking about implementing civics in a really rigorous way, both in your classroom, within your school, as a department chair?
I think for us, our students still have the same problems that our citizens do. Our students have a lot of apathy, right? And so to get them excited about it and to not have them be cynical and to be like, hey, you can do this, like you can get involved, you can affect change, is really our struggle. And that's what we're trying to focus on right now.
Great, thanks. Also seems like a really interesting opportunity to think about, if that's something that students are not sure of, they're not sure how to get involved, or they're not sure that their voice matters, right, or how to link up what they care about to action. That seems like there's a lot of opportunity for development there, whether it's, resources or programs, or so it's an interesting opportunity area for us. So I'd love to move on a little bit from some of the wonkier questions around instruction and content, vertical alignment, such an educator term, and actually go kind of zoom out again and think a little bit about how civics overlaps with issues of equity in classrooms and schools. So Peter, something that I actually heard you say is that civil rights violations in schools is a type of civic education. It's just the wrong kind. And that was really powerful for me. That really stuck with me. And I think we've also been hearing, just as we've launched this collaboration, that teachers really have a desire to think about how civics can support really critical conversations about race, about bias, and help to instruct students that all voices matter, and their voice matters. So I'd love to hear just a little bit about that. So Peter, I'd love to kick it off to you first. How do you see the topic of civics education overlapping with issues of equity in schools?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing is the point that you just made about, civil rights violation is a terrible form of civic education. That partly comes from research and that people, nerds like me, have been doing for years. I mean, not us ourselves, but others have found, for example, that if you get arrested, regardless of whether you're convicted, your chances of voting the rest of your life are much lower, regardless of even whether you're charged with anything. You just get arrested because the interaction with the police officer is just alienating you from the political system. So it partly comes from us nerds, but a lot of it comes from young people. I mean, Black Lives Matter and associated movements, I mean, they've really put this on the agenda. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that this is the reason we're talking this way is partly because of its successful youth advocacy. They've gotten attention from, more attention from people like me than we used to give it. Although I'd like to think we weren't totally ignorant of it before. But, so I guess, but more broadly, there's good civic education and bad, there's things that help kids to develop their voice and agency and skills, and there's things that hurt that. And both of those things tend to be unequally distributed to our kids. So that the most empowering activities tend to be more available in suburban schools, more available for affluent kids. And within a school that has some diversity, they often tend to be given to the kids who are, the good kids, so the kids on the college track. I always want to say, and I'm totally serious about this, that even though that's true, there are also thousands and thousands of educators around America who are kind of fighting to change that every single day and doing excellent things in classrooms with highly disadvantaged kids. But it's still true that if you look at the statistics, I mean, even something as simple as student governments are much more common in suburban schools than they are in urban schools. And suburban, student governments aren't the perfect way to do it either. Sometimes there's just popularity contests, but it's just an indicator of how unequal things are. And then on the other side of the coin, the bad civic education, for example, suspending kindergartners is much more likely if you're a young person of color or poor, and especially both. And then one other element of this is just the kind of cultural fit between the kid's life circumstances and the curriculum and teaching. So, one size does not fit all. And if in your community, for example, if people are poor, or if people have a really hard relationship with police, then a civic education that doesn't acknowledge that and deal with it is not going to be effective. So, and we do tend to, partly because we skimp on the money, we tend to produce, one textbook or whatever for everybody, instead of having some more variety. There's lots of rich things to think about. It could be that every kid does need some of the same stuff, but it might have to come as part of a package, which is pretty different for different kids. So I'm not saying everything is about cultural difference and diversity. There may be some common things that everybody needs to know. There is just one Supreme Court. It's everybody's Supreme Court. So you may all need to understand it. But on the other hand, that fits in a bigger package that has to be culturally appropriate for kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to pass it to Emma. How have you seen civics and issues of equity overlapping?
Yeah, so, thanks to the really solid work that Peter and his colleagues do, we know that students don't have equitable access to civic education. They don't even have anywhere near equal access to it. And so ultimately what we need is high quality civic education for social justice outcomes, and we need that to be distributed across all students. So civic education that supports the collective and individual work that is needed to achieve equity for everyone. And like Peter says, you're more likely to see that in places where students already have political efficacy. They already feel power. And in the places where that's not the case, the access is much more limited. But there's some sort of cautionary tales here. And I was recently in a meeting with another scholar, Joseph Kahn, and I'm not sure if this was coming from his work, although I suspect it is, that when sort of the more affluent suburban kids do action civics projects, they tend to focus on more achievable goals, right? So how to speed up the pickup or drop off line at school. And so they attack this very realistic problem, and they're successful and they feel empowered, and then they're more likely to engage in the future. Where you take a group of students in a more urban environment and they pick an issue like Black Lives Matter or police, brutality, police injustice. And that's a big, hairy problem. It's not insurmountable, and it absolutely deserves their attention. And it does my heart so good to know that the Chavez schools are going to be tackling this over the next year. But that's tough, and there's a really good chance that they're not going to succeed. And when they don't succeed, are they going to decide that, well, this isn't worth my effort? The system is rigged against me. And by the way, that would be a very reasonable conclusion to come to, but that's certainly not what we're trying to communicate to them. So I think we as educators need to be really careful. We need to be aware of what's happening. We need to be very aware of the very unequal access to high quality civic education. We need to find those examples that Peter's referring to, right? Those countless educators who are bucking the trend and who are doing incredible work in places where you least expect it. What can we learn from them? How can we replicate some of that? And that's something that's really important to me for this conversation, is not just thinking about the top 5 percentile of teachers, those rock star, veteran, master teachers. They're going to do this incredible work with or without our help. But what about everyone else? What about sort of that middle percentile of teachers? What do they need? What resources, what hacks, what solutions, what encouragement, so that whether they're in a suburban school, an urban school, or any other type of environment, that they're taking this seriously and making sure their students are getting the access that we want to see.
Wow, thank you, Emma. That's great. So with a couple minutes left, what I'd love to do is pass it to all panelists with this question, which is sort of a hopes and dreams, or hopes and fears for teachers as they embark on their 10-week design journey to reimagine civic education for their classrooms and for their schools. So just thinking about all the themes that we've heard, the opportunities, what are some of the wishes that you all have for educators out there who are hungry to tackle this question within their own context? And then we'll hear from you all, and then we'll open it up to field some questions from listeners. So I'll first pass it to Eric. What is a wish that you have?
I was still thinking of my wish now. I think that I'm just hoping that people are, and teachers are going to be open and, I guess, sort of creative in their ways of thinking about civic education, not to think about it in terms of explicitly, or only think about it in terms of explicitly thinking about, like, what I think about as my 8th grade, the branches of government, how a bill becomes a law, where, Schoolhouse Rocks comes into, the Schoolhouse Rocks videos, and people think they covered it. And really think about, I think, more of what Peter started to talk about, which almost broaches character education in some ways too, but this holistic idea of civics education, and sort of not being or feeling pigeonholed by some of those pitfalls that we talked about earlier.
Great. I'd love to pass it to Crystal. What's a wish that you have?
I think my wish is for all my teachers to see it as an opportunity to go beyond what's required, right? So I think it's a challenge, but it's a good challenge. And I think there's a way that we can do it, and we can connect with the kids and make it really relevant to them. And that's what's going to make them learn, right? That's what's going to help them learn and then hopefully go on and tackle anything, right? And then ideally, in a perfect world, it would be to do it cross curriculum, but I think that's a bigger dream, right? But that's the first dream.
That's a great first dream. I love that. This is a great opportunity to challenge the status quo. I think that's absolutely right. Emma, what's one wish that you have?
Yeah, so my wish is that we that folks really focus on practical in-class solutions. I work for iCivics. We're all about knowledgeable action, and what we're able to do, practically speaking, is focus on that knowledge. And we want to inspire the action, but the knowledge first, and make sure it's connected and relevant and interesting. And I think what's really important when you do that is to also focus on the skills. And Eric got at this beautifully when he was talking about vertical alignment. Researching, using evidence, framing questions, critical thinking, all of that is so important, and we can build upon that every year. But I know, because I was once a first-year teacher, I know how scary it is, the idea of getting outside of the classroom. And so communicating to teachers and providing resources that say, it's okay if nothing ever happens outside of the classroom. We want that. That's the ideal. We want to push them out there. But if that never happens, that's okay. You're still giving them the skills and the knowledge that they need and the inspiration they need inside the classroom. And likewise, if you get out into the community and it's not a success, that's okay too. How do we help students reflect on that, evaluate that, so that they're not leaving completely disillusioned? So I want to see the big, crazy, innovative hacks, but I also want to see the really practical solutions that meet teachers where they are, and that really embrace the realities of the classroom.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma. And then last but not least, Peter, what that you have for educators out there?
Keeping a little list, really short, but a little list of the things that we've been talking about on this call, on this webinar, that teachers might be able to address. No lousy assessments. So could teachers invent some really clever assessment ideas that at least they could use in their own classroom? Lack of support for high quality engaging civics. So could teachers and their students figure out ways to actually increase the support outside the classroom for good civics? Limited time. So could teachers figure out how to insert some extra civics in other places like math as they do at Chavez? And then cultural diversity. So would there be some teachers with particular student populations, or the teacher's own background, who could bring in some forms of civics that were appropriate for the huge number of diverse populations? There's tremendous diversity in our country, and everybody needs a different kind of civics. So could we add to avoid the one size fits all?
That's great, and a great list. Wonderful, thanks so much for that. So we have 2 questions. First is actually from Crystal, which I think is a really interesting one. And thanks for asking it, Crystal. So I think there's this question of how might assessments work in classrooms, these rich, interactive, really robust type of assessments we've been talking about. How would those work in classrooms with a high population of either special needs students or high populations or high populations of English language learners? So any thoughts on that? I mean, Crystal, you may even have some thoughts on that, which would be great.
Yeah, I was thinking that it almost might be better for them than the cookie cutter test of, bubble in your answer, true, false kind of thing. Because then they can make that connection. They can be like, this is civics in action, this is politics in action, or government in action. And that's going to be so much better for them than I memorize some terms and I can regurgitate them.
Yeah, totally. Emma?
Yeah, when you said English language learners, I just thought, voice, right? So the big question is, what should schools and communities do to help students find their unique civic voice? And one thing I know about English language learners is that a really great way to engage them in content area classrooms and socialized classrooms is to provide structured opportunities for academic language production. And that ultimately gets down to voice, helping them find their voice, helping them find the words, but also sort of the meaning behind it. And that's going to benefit all students. And that's what I've always loved about strategies for helping your English language learners and perhaps your struggling readers, is that what you do for them is also going to help all your students. But I think that kind of focus on opportunities for students to talk, and maybe not just through sort of formal classroom discussion, but in any sort of way, allowing students to produce language, academic language, action-based language, social justice-based language, that I think that could make a difference.
That's great. Thanks, Emma. We have another question, which is how might we personalize teaching government? And this is actually a theme that's kind of come up a little bit in this discussion already about how the nuances and challenges of each community is different. And yet there's also this one-size-fits-all approach currently with civics. And so how do we get much more localized as we instruct civics so that the challenges that students are taking on are really relevant and important to them personally, to their communities. So we'd love to hear just a little bit about that. What are some ways that we might personalize civics instruction? And
I'll jump in.
Yeah, great.
I actually think you started to answer some of the question as you were asking it, in the sense that you personalize it by making it relevant for the kids and having, people having them investigate things that impact their lives and are meaningful to them. I was even thinking this in terms of the ELL and SPED question before, because a lot of times motivation is the best accommodation. So if there's high interest and the kids are invested, that's going to personalize it in that way. And I think that there's two pieces, right? There's this holistic, that this is the way things work, and that is sort of not a one size fits all. The kids need to know that this is how it works, but how do you use that, and how do you use that system to improve and advocate for your issues in your community, in your place? And I think part of that's just defining what are the biases and inequities that exist in our community. And, in some cases, we even need to challenge our educators about their own biases and that they're bringing to the classroom in order to have that conversation with the kids as well. But I think that's a huge piece, and it goes back to student voice to find out, we have to talk to the kids and then let them speak to what's relevant to them.
Anyone else have thoughts on that before we get to the next question?
It's a quick thought that there's kind of hopefully a positive relationship, but it's sometimes a tricky relationship between individualized and personalized politics. And then the other thing we're trying to do is have collective action by kids. So kids in some ways thinking of themselves as a we more than they do already. So I think you can do both if you have a vigorous discussion preceding collective action, and the kid feels like a voice, but it's not all, that's making it a little easier than it actually is, because in some ways there can be real tensions.
That's interesting. We have one other question. So I think there's actually two kind of questions. We'll get to both of them. Well, we have time for one more. So let's get to this question from Steve around social justice. So Steve is asking, could social justice language be potentially a barrier or a pitfall in some regions? And what are ways that teachers might confront that? How to deal with that?
So I have to chime in here and say that, Steve's really validating a concern I expressed via email, Emma, to you and to others about sort of how we're framing the question. And it's because Steve's here in Florida where I am. And so although I think he's a very enlightened educator, I consider myself one too. We know the population, and we know that in some school districts here in Florida, just using those very words are going to turn people off, and they're going to assume a liberal agenda and be very suspicious of it. And this is just sort of anecdotal. It's just sort of something I've been thinking a lot about, how language is so important and how so many words have become part of this PC debate. And if you were to talk about social justice without saying social justice, I think you'd be okay. If you were to talk about what it means to provide trigger warnings and provide safe spaces for students, but never use the word trigger, and never say safe spaces, I think people would find all of that to be very reasonable. And so we need to be careful with what words we're adopting, especially in a formal capacity. If you just talk to people, whether it's parents or administrators or your students, and say, here's what I'm trying to do, I think you'll find a lot of agreement and support. But if you frame it all using sort of this vocabulary that we like to use, be prepared for some pushback.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that we've seen jargon across all content areas actually be a barrier, and so even that the language of social justice, well, what does that really mean? Or when we're talking about equity, well, what does that actually mean? And actually the same has been true for civic education. That can be a buzzword in some ways. So I think that's a really good final sort of like caveat almost to educators, which is one, develop a solution that feels really right for students, that's going to be student-centered, that has the potential to be really interactive and robust. But also know that as you're socializing it, which is a big part of the work of an educator when they're bringing a new idea to a school, to really be thoughtful and careful around that framing. So I think that's a really good point from Steve, and a great point, Emma, as well.
And Crystal just made a great counterpoint in her comment that I think deserves voice here, about how for some communities, a term like social justice would really engage them and pull them in. So just really knowing your community, knowing your audience, it's so important always.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I want to end with one final thank you to our panelists and to our listeners and everyone who chimed in with a question. We are so excited for the next 10 weeks with our civic education collaboration. And I want to end with a sort of call to action, which is that if you're an educator out there listening to this, to dive in at the Teachers Guild. And you can start off with some activities in our Discover phase, which is all about collecting insights, asking students what matters to them as you embark on your design journey. So thanks so much for tuning in, and to our amazing panelists, thank you so much for all of these knowledge bombs and incredible words of wisdom. Really fun to have you all here for this past hour. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye all.